What is the role of death and fear of death in life?
Well, from our perspective, the uniquely human awareness of death and our unwillingness to accept that fact, we would argue, is the primary motivational impetus for almost everything that people do, whether they're aware of it or not.
So that's kind of been your life work, your view of the human condition is that death, you've written the book, Warm at the Core, that death is at the core of our consciousness, of everything, of how we see the world, of what drives us. Maybe can you elaborate how you see death fitting in? What does it mean to be at the core of our being?
So I think that's a great question. And, to be pedantic, I usually start, my psychology classes, and I say to the students, okay, let's define our terms. And the ology part, they get right away. It's the study of. And then we get to the psyche part. And understandably, the students are like, oh, that means mind. And I'm like, well, no, that's a modern interpretation. But in the ancient Greek, it means soul, but not in the Cartesian dualistic sense that most of us in the West think when that word comes to mind. And so you hear the word soul and you're like, well, all right, that's the non-physical part of me that's potentially detachable from my corporal container when I'm no longer here. But Aristotle's, who coined the word psyche, I think, he was not a dualist. He was a monist. He thought that the soul was inextricably connected to the body, and he defined soul as the essence of a natural body that is alive. And then he goes on and he says, all right, let me give you an example. If an axe was alive, the soul of an axe would be to chop. And if you can pluck your eyeball out of your head and it was still functioning, then the soul of the eyeball would be to see. And then he's like, all right, the soul of a grasshopper is to hop. The soul of a woodpecker is to peck, which raises the question, of course, what is the essence of what it means to be human? And here, of course, there is no one universally accepted conception of the essence of our humanity. All right, Aristotle, gives us the idea of humans as rational animals. We're Homo sapiens. But not the only game in town. You got Joseph Huizinga, an anthropologist in the 20th century. He called us Homo ludens, that we're basically fundamentally playful creatures. And then I think it was Hannah Arendt, Homo faber, we're tool-making creatures. Another woman, Ellen Dissanayake, wrote a book called Homo aestheticus. And following Aristotle and his poetics, she's like, well, we're not only rational animals, we're also aesthetic creatures that appreciate beauty. There's another take on humans. I think they call us Homo narratans. We're storytelling creatures. And I think all of those designations of what it means to be human are quite useful heuristically and certainly worthy of our collective cogitation. But what garnered my attention when I was a young punk was just a single line in an essay by a Scottish guy. It was Alexander Smith, in a book called Dreamthorpe. I think it's written in the 1860s. He just says right in the middle of an essay, it is our knowledge that we have to die that makes us human. And I remember reading that, and in my gut, I was like, oh, man, I don't like that, but I think you're onto something. And then William James, the great Harvard philosopher and arguably the first academic psychologist, he referred to death as the worm at the core of the human condition. So that's where the worm at the core idea comes in. And that's just an allusion to the story of Genesis, back in the proverbial old days in the Garden of Eden, everything was going tremendously well until the serpent tempts Eve to take a chomp out of the apple of the tree of knowledge, and Adam partakes also. And this is, according to the Bible, what brings death into the world. And from our vantage point, the story of Genesis is a remarkable allegorical recount of the origin of consciousness, where we get to the point where, by virtue of our vast intelligence, we come to realize the inevitability of death. And so, the apple is beautiful and it's tasty. But when you get right into the middle of it, there's that ugly reality, which is our finitude. And then fast forward a bit, and I was a young professor at Skidmore College in 1980. My PhD is in experimental social psychology, and I mainly did studies with clinical psychologists evaluating the efficacy of non-pharmacological interventions to reduce stress. And that was good work, and I found it interesting. But in my first week as a professor at Skidmore, I just walking up and down the shelves of the library, saw some books by a guy I had never heard of, Ernest Becker. A cultural anthropologist, recently deceased. He died in 1974. After weeks before, actually, he was posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction for his book, The Denial of Death.
And that was his last book?
It's actually his next to last book. I don't know how you pull this off, but he had one more after he died called Escape from Evil. And evidently it was supposed to, originally The Denial of Death was supposed to be this giant 1,000-page book that was both. And they split it up, and what became Escape from Evil, his wife, Marie Becker, finished. Well, be that as it may, it is in The Denial of Death where Becker just says it in the first paragraph, I believe, that the terror of death and the way that human beings respond to it or decline to respond to it is primarily responsible for almost everything we do, whether we're aware of it or not, and mostly we're not. And so I read that first paragraph, Lex, and I was like, wow, okay, this dude.
You're onto something.
You're onto something.
It's the same thing.
It's the same thing. And then it reminded me, I think, not to play psychologist, but, let's face it, I believe there's a reason why we end up drifting where we ultimately come to. So I'm in my mid-20s. I got Ernest Becker's book in my hand. And the next thing I know, I'm remembering when I'm 8 years old, the day that my grandmother died. And, the day before, my mom said, "Oh, say goodbye to Grandma. She's not well." And okay, so I was like, "Okay, Grandma." And I knew she wasn't well, but I didn't really appreciate the magnitude of her illness. Well, she dies the next day. And it's in the evening, and I'm just sitting there looking at my stamp collection. And I'm like, wow, I'm going to miss my grandmother. And then I'm like, no, wait a minute. That means my mother's going to die and after she gets old. And that's even worse. After all, who's going to make me dinner? And that bothered me for a while. But then I'm looking at the stamps, all the dead American presidents. And I'm like, there's George Washington. He's dead. There's Thomas Jefferson. He's dead. My mom's going to be dead. Oh, I'm going to get old and be dead someday. And at 8 years old, that was my first explicit existential crisis. I remember it being, one of these blood-curdling realizations that I tried my best to ignore for the most of the time I was subsequently growing up. But fast forward back to Skidmore College, mid-20s, reading Becker's book in the 1980s, thinking to myself, wow, one of the reasons why I'm finding this so compelling is that it squares with my own personal experience. And then, to make a short story long, and I'll shut up, Lex, but what grabbed me about Becker, and this is in part because I read a lot of his other books. There's another book, The Birth and Death of Meaning, which is framed from an evolutionary perspective. And then The Denial of Death is really more framed from an existential psychodynamic vantage point. And as a young academic, I was really taken by what I found to be a very potent juxtaposition that you really don't see that often. Yet usually evolutionary types are eager to dismiss the psychodynamic types, and vice versa. And maybe only John Bowlby, there's other folks, but the attachment theorist, John Bowlby, was really one of the first serious academics to say these ways of thinking about things are quite compatible. And
can you comment on what a psychodynamics view of the world is versus an evolutionary view of the world, just in case people are not familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fine question. Well, for the evolutionary types in general are interested in how it is and why it is that we have adapted to our surroundings in the service of persisting over time and being represented in the gene pool thereafter.
You used to be a fish.
Yes.
We used to be a fish, and now, and now we ended up talking on a podcast. So how we came to be that way.
How we came to be that way. And so, whereas the existential psychodynamic types, I would say, are more interested in development across a single lifespan. But the evolutionary types dismiss the psychodynamic types as overly speculative and devoid of empirical support for their views. They'll just say these guys are talking shit, if you'll pardon the expression. Yeah. And of course, you can turn right around and say the same about the evolutionary types. They are often and rightfully criticized, evolutionary psychologists, for what are called the just so stories, where it's like, oh, this is probably why fill in the blank is potentially adaptive. And my thought, again, early on, was I didn't see any intrinsic antithesis between these viewpoints. I just found them dialectically compatible and very powerful when combined.